Next presentation is Spring MVC miscellaneous features. So here we are going to talk about exception handling, and we'll talk about locale handling and concept of value annotation and Spring expression language SPEL. And we'll talk about how we can configure static resources such as CSS files and things like that. We'll see how we can perform logging, and also we can see how we can do source code level debugging. So these are the topics that are not really related to each other, but somewhere we need to talk about it. So I put those things together into miscellaneous topic. Excuse me. Let's talk about the exception handling. Spring has exception handler notation, so basically it will handle exceptions, specifying what exception is going to handle. So in this case, we have inside the controller, by the way, so this exception handler will handle any exceptions that are occurring within this controller, as long as that exception is a type of, in this case, IO exception. Okay, so all IO exception and its subclasses, maybe file not found exception and things like that, will be handled by exception handler. Okay, so in this case, basically this method will just get the exception object, and then in this case we are not doing anything with it, but we just return, so we basically have a prepare response entity from the exception object, just indicating something happened and stuff like that, and then send the response back. So basically this method is handling any IO exception, any subclass exception happening in this controller. Now, in many cases, you want to share the same exception handler method for all controllers. In our previous case, this exception handler will handle only exceptions occurring in this particular controller, so it cannot be shared by other controllers. Now, if you want to share your exception handler method to be shared across the controllers, because that could be pretty common, right? What you can do is that you can specify what is called controller advice, and you specify the package. So what it means is that your exception handler, in this case, this guy, will handle any exceptions that occur in any controllers, as long as those controllers are in the same base package, in this case com.jpassion.mvc. so controller advice is a way to share exception handler across the controllers. Pretty straightforward concept. Response status annotation, you can use it to assign a particular status code to your exception object. So we have an exception class called the resource not found exception. So when we send back some kind of HTTP response, we want to actually assign 44. So by the way, this is the enum of 44, HTTP status not found. So we are assigning 44 status code whenever resource not found exception is being thrown. Okay, so it marks a method of exception class with a status code and reason that should be returned. Okay, so basically status code is applied to the HTTP response. Okay, if you want to actually assign a different status code, that's perfectly fine. So you would say http.status and whatever number of that as well. So what happens under the cover? So as I said before, Spring is a collection of interfaces and implementations of those interfaces. So exception handling is not an exception. So it does have handler exception resolver interface, and then there are some implementations of this interface, and this is to handle exceptions. So beyond the scenes, in fact, there are multiple classes that are pre-configured to handle exceptions. So exception handler, exception resolver matches uncaught exceptions against a suitable exception handler method in both handler and any controller advices. So this is the class that actually pass the exception to your exception handler method. Okay. Response status exception handler looks for uncaught exceptions annotated by response status. So we just take a look at the response status annotation, right? So this class is responsible for assigning that status to any method, any class, exception class with the annotated value of response status annotation. Default handler exception resolver converts standard Spring exceptions and converts them to HTTP status code. So that's something we haven't learned yet. So that is in fact the next slide. So Spring has a bunch of pre-built exception classes. For example, conversion not supported exception. So if you're trying to convert string into a number, then you are going to have a conversion not supported exception. In that case, the HTTP status code is going to be set with a 500. HTTP media type not acceptable exception is that if client is asking for some kind of response type in the accept header, so client will actually set the desired response type such as XML or JSON in accept header, but if the server application cannot handle it, then it will return 4.6. HTTP media type not supported exception. Yeah, so this is a case that when client sends some data, setting the content type, and if the server application cannot read the data type, then it will return 4.5. No such request handling method exception. Of course, that is a 4.4. Type mismatch exception 400, and missing servlet request parameter exception. So these are subset of built-in exception classes, and whenever those exceptions occur, it will automatically set the status code 500, 46, 45, 415, 44, 400, and 400, and things like that. So that is being assigned through a default handler exception resolver class, which is pre-configured. Okay. Okay, so let's do the lab. So we're going to actually do error handling. So let's see, we are going to open the lab documentation, labs, miscellaneous, and index. Okay, so we are going to do MVC basics error handling, and we're going to actually run it. Basically, we are going to have four errors. So we are trying to access account 3, which is not present. Okay, so here it's going to display account message 3 is not available on this date. It should actually display today's date, and then failed URL. Okay, so these are the information that we actually display. Okay, so let's actually try to run it, and then we'll dissect the application error handling. So let's stop the server and then run as Java application. Okay, sys deployed, and let's go to 8080. Okay, so basically when you go to 80, when you actually go to the 8080, that it tried to go to the account 3, and so if you see this message exception handler in this application worked as expected. In fact, this is actually coming from the server application. Okay, so let's see the code. Okay, so we have so when user is trying to access a particular user, okay, so in this case 3, by the way, we basically using in this case, let's see the configuration. Yeah, so we have configured redirection here. So when the user goes to the root, we automatically go to account 3. Okay, so, and we know that account 3 is not present, right? So it should actually cause resource not found exception. This resource not found exception will be thrown. Okay, and that's basically the code that we have seen here. So yeah, I'm gonna just use the lab documentation. So when account is not available, account null exception, yeah, in fact we should actually see that message somewhere. Well, let's assume it is there. Okay, and basically we are throwing resource not found exception. Okay, and because resource not found exception is from Spring Framework, you know, it's basically one of, oh, resource not found exception is actually ours, right? Okay, yeah, this is our class. And in resource not found exception, basically what we have done is that we are going to get the resource ID. So this exception class has two fields, resource ID and the date. Okay, all right. So you know the date that we are seeing, in fact, is it should be actually today's date, 2016 and September 29. So that is today's date, right? And also URL is also actually specified. It doesn't, no, this one doesn't have any URL. So let's actually see the controller. Yes, so this is the case. So we are just throwing the resource not found exception. Now we have this code, exception handler. So in this exception handler will be invoked because there is in fact the resource not found exception object thrown, right? So it will catch it. Okay, Spring Framework will catch it, and then it will actually, so you know, meaning it will invoke this method. Okay, so it will create a model and view object, and here we add two attributes, exception and URL. All right, and you know, then we are going to set the view name, so it will display account not available JSP page. So if you take a look at the account not available JSP page, this one, account not available JSP page, we can access that model attribute called the exception, and we are just displaying resource ID, and we are also accessing the date field of the exception object, and we are specifying the pattern that we want to display, and we also specify model attribute called URL. So that URL is again set by the in this exception handler method. Okay, so that is the exercise. All right, and this is the exception class, and here we just automatically go to the account 3. Okay, and so this is the account not available JSP page, which we just saw. Okay, so now, so that is going to actually handle exceptions only thrown in the in this controller. In fact, we have only a single controller, is probably that doesn't matter. But suppose if we have another controller, and if that controller will actually create another the same kind of exceptions. Okay, so what you're going to do is we are going to create the account controller 2 in the same package, and we're going to just, you know, the change to account 2 is going to be account, yeah, and then code is pretty much the same. Okay, and then we're going to actually try the restart the application, and we're going to try to account 2 3 like this. Okay, so we are not going to use the controller device yet, and you can actually observe that you know, when you are going to go to the second controller, the resource not found exception is thrown, but it's not really being handled because that controller does not have yeah, if you take a look at this guy, you know, this one doesn't have its own exception handler. Okay, so let's actually do that. So I'm gonna just copy, and then we are going to create, we're going to paste it, and we're gonna name it as account controller 2. Yeah, it's kind of slow. And then we're gonna actually remove the exception handler code from account controller 2, so that any exception that occurs in the account 2 is not going to get caught. Okay, so account controller 2, okay, so that's good. So account controller 2, and here we certainly want to use a different URL, account 2, and we want to make sure we delete this guy. Okay. Alright, so we save the change. So we have two controllers, but because in account controller, this is only available to this controller, so let's actually run the application, and then let's run it again, run as Java application. And main application. Okay, so it's deployed. Let's go over here and 8080. So this one should work as expected, right? Okay, because we are actually going to the first controller, and the first controller has exception handler. Now if I try to go to the account 2, okay, which is the second controller, let's see what happens. So you can see it returns 500, okay, because it doesn't know what to do with it. Alright, so what we can do at this point is we are going to use a controller device. So here we are going to use controller device on this package. So because both controllers are on the same base package, if I add controller device of this guy on the first controller here, alright, now so let me import the class. Okay, so save the change and stop the server, and now let's run it again. This time the same exception handler should be available to both controllers. Okay, it's deployed. So let's go to 8080. So this one worked, the first controller. Now even if we access the second controller with the account 2, okay, it still should work. So you can see it's actually displaying the URL correctly, account 2 and 3, and the account number is not available on this date. So that exception occurred in the second controller is still being handled by the exception handler written for the controller number 1. Okay, so that is an exercise. Let's see, for your own exercise, create your own custom exception called myException. Throw an instance of myException when account number start with 2. Okay, so maybe account number 22, 23 or something like that. Handle the exception using exception handler and controller device annotation. So this is a little bit artificial exercise, but you get the point. So I'll give you guys about the 10 to 15 minutes to do exercise 1.